afternoon. I'm Al Kresta. The seven deadly vices have a long and distinguished history within Christian moral reflection. And our contemporary culture doesn't take them very seriously. They even dismiss them as having no great historic value. My guest, Rebecca DeYoung, teaches philosophy at Calvin College and has published papers on various vices and virtues in the Thomist, Medieval Philosophy and Theology, and she's the author of several books. Tell me a little bit about the history of the seven deadly sins. How did they become seven? What role did they play in Christian moral reflection through the Middle Ages?
I am fascinated by the beginnings of the seven deadly sins because we find antecedents of many of the virtues in Greek philosophy, but the seven deadly sins turn out to be something that emerged from a group of practicing Christians out in the Egyptian desert, the desert fathers and mothers, in the early centuries of Christianity. And from that desert community emerged a kind of spiritual direction, soul care practice, and part of that practice was self-examination. And the vices turned up as a list of the things that monks in the desert most struggled with. Very common temptations, not necessarily the worst possible things that you could do, but definitely things that if you spent a serious amount of time practicing ascetic disciplines in the desert, these were the things that were going to show up. And they had strategies for how to deal with them, spiritual disciplines and spiritual direction. And that tradition was sort of messy and unorganized. It wasn't meant to be an academic, neat systems of sevens. So when the medievals picked this up through St. Benedict, John Cassian, Gregory the Great, and finally Thomas Aquinas, there was a desire then, once they got into the university system and catechesis, to sort of make things a little bit neater. It got narrowed down to a system of sevens. The systematizers pulled pride off the list and made it the root of the remaining seven. I would speculate because of the need for a nifty catechism. Everything else comes in sevens.
This is, does this serve as kind of a medieval psychology?
I think it's really just a commentary on human experience in the process of spiritual formation. These are very common obstacles. Imagine that you did spiritual counseling for about 30 years, and then someone asked you, so what are the top 10 things that typically come up for people? The list of the vices is what you get in answer to that kind of question.
Okay, so we've got pride as the root, and then envy, vainglory, sloth, avarice, anger, gluttony, and lust. Do they have corresponding virtues?
Some do. You'll notice right away, if you're familiar with the list of the seven virtues, the three theological virtues, and then the four cardinal virtues, there's no neat matchup here, and it's not intended to be a one-to-one correspondence. It is interesting that something like vainglory doesn't have an easy correlate in terms of a virtue as its opposite, nor is there a particular spiritual discipline for each one of the vices.
If you look at modern society, postmodern society, and compared the way it prioritizes these vices with the Middle Ages, do you see much difference?
What I see is a lot of spiritual and moral issues just falling off the radar screen altogether.
Wow. Okay.
And sometimes this is because we just don't have names for things anymore. We don't have a name for a vice like vainglory. That is part of common conversation in English. If we did have the concept and the name for it, it would be fascinating to see what sort of conversations would arise, what kinds of attention-seeking are disordered and which kinds are not. Kind
of impression management, cultivation of image.
What you really want to understand is that these were for sort of heart diagnostics. Physicians and internal attachment are getting in the way of our love for God. There can often be outward symptoms where there's no internal vice, or there can be an internal vice with no outward symptoms. So you have to be careful when diagnosing. That's why you need a spiritual director and not just a behavioral checklist.